Some people might say that real courage is when you think you're beaten before you start, but you start anyway and see it through, no matter the odds. The streets of North Shields echoes with tales of men and women who have fought over the years for what's right and stood up against oppression and suppression of basic human rights. One such was Ralph Gardner, a name familiar to many in Shields, and this stone marks the spot where Gardner's cottage once stood, here on Churton Green. It commemorates a life dedicated to a cause that transformed the fortunes of his hometown and eventually freed it from a Newcastle stranglehold that had lasted for 600 years. It is a tale of power, corruption, and often violence perpetrated by those in high office, and how one ordinary man took on the might of kings and council. Ralph died without ever knowing how his work eventually altered the course of history for Shields, and this is his story. Ralph Gardner was born in Newcastle in 1625 and was christened here in St John the Baptist Church in the city. His father, Devereux Gardner, worked in a local law firm and later became writing master, a teacher of English, at Queen Elizabeth Grammar School. But after just 7 years in this role, he was paid off with the sum of £10 in respect of his poverty. So, the family were not well off. But by the time Gardner came of age in 1646, he was sufficiently well educated to carry the position of a young gentleman with some confidence. He also possessed a basic understanding of common and statute law, passed on to him by his father, and this would stand him in good stead in the years to come. At this time, Newcastle was fast becoming one of the wealthiest and most powerful provincial cities in England. The free hostmen of Newcastle, along with the city's guilds, held a monopoly over trading rights on the Tyne, granted to them by royal charters centuries ago. This cartel effectively stifled the economic growth of North Shields for over 400 years. On several occasions during this period of time, armed men from Newcastle burned large parts of Shields to the ground, calling it a town where no town ought to be. Businesses were destroyed. The population drifted away to look for work elsewhere. At the age of 25, Ralph was already a prominent figure in Shields. He would become a member of the 4 and 20, a group of influential businessmen who helped run the affairs of Tynemouth Parish. He was also brewing beer on a large scale in Churton, but this was deemed illegal under the Newcastle monopoly. Driven partly by self-interest, but also a hatred of injustice, young Ralph made it his mission in life to overturn the stranglehold Newcastle had over trade on the Tyne, calling those in power unchristian, illegal, oppressive, and repugnant to the very laws of England. So, in chambers not unlike this one, and with their wealth and power on display for all to see, the free hostmen and guilds of Newcastle plotted to silence the young upstart from Shields. In 1652, Ralph was arrested on trumped-up charges for alleged non-payment of fines due on his brewing business, amounting to £900. He was thrown into a prison cell, possibly here at the Castle Keep in Newcastle, reported locally as being over 36 feet high and removed from all comfort. No trial was ever held. Ralph Gardner endured appalling conditions. He was denied bail, legal counsel, visitors, and even access to fresh air. True to his defiant spirit, Gardner escaped from his prison cell with the help of a fellow inmate, John Cuthbertson, and eventually returned to his brewing business in Shields, an open and provocative snub to the hostmen, aldermen, and merchants of Newcastle. In early 1653, the mayor of Newcastle, becoming increasingly enraged at Gardner's open defiance, dispatched armed constables to Shields with swords drawn and pistols cocked to deal with him once and for all. Ralph and his family were only saved from injury or even death by a band of seamen and fishermen who, upon hearing of the attack, rushed to his aid and drove the attackers off. Ralph was not at liberty for long and once again found himself in prison, It was here, shaking with cold in his tower cell, that he realised the only way to truly end the Newcastle monopoly was through the law. So, while still in prison, he set about gathering and documenting evidence to build a compelling case, fit for presentation to the highest court in the land, Parliament. Between January and May of 1653, Ralph gathered together copious amounts of evidence and prepared his arguments in the form of a petition. It stated that royal charter law was in direct contravention of the statute laws of the land, and therefore the Newcastle monopoly was illegal. Ralph's petition was presented for reading in Parliament on the 29th of September, 1653. The mayor and hostmen of Newcastle were outraged at this assault on their rights, and, no doubt wary of the potential consequences, asked for a 2-week delay to gather their own defence. Following intense lobbying, a further delay was then granted, pushing back the debate in Parliament to the 13th of December, 1653. The Civil War had raged in England between 1642 and 1651. Charles I had been executed, and in 1653, Oliver Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector. England had become a republic. In a cruel twist of fate, Cromwell dissolved Parliament on the 12th of December 1653, the very day before Gardner's petition was due to be debated. This effectively ended Ralph's opposition to the monopoly and pushed back reforms on the Tyne for another 200 years. Although chastened by this defeat, Gardner was not completely disheartened, saying that as the petition had neither been debated or voted upon, it had therefore never been disproved, giving hope to those that followed to continue the fight. In 1655, Ralph Gardner published his seminal work, England's Grievance Discovered, and what had started out as a local problem now became a national issue, and it kept Gardner's cause alive in the decades that followed. So, what happened to Ralph and his family? We know he was warden here at the church in Tynemouth Priory for a time, and an entry in the minutes of a meeting of the 4 and 20 in 1659 has him being removed to London. Perhaps he and his family left Shields to avoid further clashes with the housemen and merchants of Newcastle. A few years later, a scurrilous rumour was put about by Alderman Ambrose Barnes of Newcastle that Gardner had been hanged at Tyburn in 1661 for coining, but this was later disproved. We have no record of when or where Ralph Gardner died, or where he was buried. We know that 2 of his children died in their early years and were buried here in Tynemouth Priory, but his wife Catherine and the remaining children seem to have disappeared from the history books. In the years that followed, Gardner's words continued to keep the struggle against the Newcastle monopoly alive. Almost 200 years after Cromwell dissolved Parliament and killed Gardner's petition, a new band of reformers came together to carry the fight to Newcastle once again. Henry Anson Brightman, Captain William Linskill and Dr. Thomas Leach were prominent among them. In 1849, they drew up the Tyne Conservancy Bill, which was approved by the Admiralty, passed by the Commons, supported by the government, and read twice in the House of Lords. Victory was in sight at last. And yet, having successfully cleared every obstacle, the bill ran out of parliamentary time, mainly due to delays and hostility from the Corporation of Newcastle, and, bizarrely, the start of the grouse shooting season. One commentator reported, "The Tyne might have had their verdict before the first moorcock could flutter in its own blood upon the heather." Like Gardner before them, Brightman and his colleagues remained undaunted, one declaring, "Courage then, brothers, and hurrah for the campaign of 1850. Such was the clamour for change, the reformers drew up the Tyne Improvement Act, which finally received royal assent and was passed into law on the 15th of July, 1850. The stewardship of the river was at last removed from the city of Newcastle and passed on to the Tyne Improvement Commission. The stranglehold on the river had finally been released. Over the centuries, the Corporation of Newcastle had so badly neglected the river in its pursuit of profit that it was almost impossible for large ships to navigate upstream. In 1854, the Tyne Commissioners started an ambitious programme of development and improvements, And by 1910, 23 million tons of cargo was being handled by the port of Tyne. All of this begs the question, what could North Shields have become had Ralph Gardner and his petition to Parliament succeeded back in 1653? Could it have been one of the great port towns of England? Perhaps even a city could have emerged to rival Newcastle. Unfortunately, we can only speculate. But what about Ralph Gardner the man? What does our story as we know it tell us about him? He married Catherine Reed, the widow of a local coal mine owner. Staunch and steadfast, she ran Gardner's business while he was in prison and raised his children. Ralph was ambitious and driven, not only in expanding his business interests, but also in applying himself to the wider affairs of Tynemouth Parish through the 4 and 20. Undoubtedly, his opposition to the Newcastle monopoly was partly driven by self-interest. His business would have benefited greatly from its removal. But what was good for him was also good for trade on the Tyne. He clearly had a great spirit and probably a temper to match, but he was also a principled man, never stepping outside of the law to pursue his case against the monopoly. Ralph Gardner appears in Shields' 800-year history for a brief moment, but he deserves to be remembered among the ranks of men and women from Shields. The artists, the innovators, the activists, the educators, and the heroes who have shaped this town over the centuries. We should be proud of them all, and the town where no town ought to be, that we call home.